Okay, so you've seen all those headlines, right? Scroll through a few articles maybe about this big news. But you want to really understand what's actually going on, why it matters, and you want to get there fast.
Yeah.
That's what we do. We do deep dives. Today we're taking a super close look at this call that President Trump is supposed to be having with Russian President Putin this coming Tuesday, March 18th, 2025. And they're going to be talking about, you guessed it, the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, and we're going to try to unpack this idea of a 30-day ceasefire, which has been proposed, and this pretty major concept of dividing up assets, like land and power plants and all the different viewpoints and the roadblocks that are kind of popping up at this really critical point.
Yeah, for sure. So the goal here is to get you a deep understanding without having to wade through tons of, details. And our job is to kind of pull out those core insights for you from all the material you've given us.
That's exactly.
Okay, so let's just dive right into it. This planned call, Trump actually announced it himself on Air Force One, and he said that he wants to try and end this war, which has been going on now for 3 years since Russia launched that full-scale invasion back in 2022. And he's actually sounded pretty optimistic.
He did.
Saying there's a very good chance of progress.
Yeah, that optimism is definitely something to pay attention to, especially when you think about just how complicated this whole thing is. The Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, he confirmed the call is happening, but he didn't give us any more details, really. But the timing is kind of interesting. This call is happening just a week after U.S. and Ukrainian delegates met in Saudi Arabia, and they were the ones who proposed this 30-day ceasefire idea. So it makes you wonder if Trump is trying to, build on that, or maybe he's got something completely new up his sleeve.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So let's focus on that 30-day ceasefire for a minute. We know that Ukraine has said yes to it.
They have.
Which feels like a pretty big step, towards peace.
It is a step, for sure. But then Putin, he kind of threw a wrench in things. He said at a press conference in Moscow that he supported the idea in principle. Okay, but then he immediately added this really important caveat. He said more discussions were needed, and he specifically mentioned the U.S. and Ukraine as the key players that he needed to talk to more. So that kind of makes you wonder, how committed Russia actually is to this whole thing right now.
Yeah, totally. And actually, we even have some clues about what Putin's specific concerns are with this ceasefire. Apparently, he brought up 3 big questions last week. The first one was all about the status of Ukrainian troops in that Russian border region of Kursk. So why is that area so important in this whole conversation?
Well, if we kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture, Kursk, it's a Russian region that shares a border with Ukraine, right? And it became this really sensitive spot after Ukraine launched that incursion back in August 2024. They actually managed to get a foothold there. Now, Russia's saying they've taken back control of most of that territory. But the fact that Ukraine was able to get into Russia in the first place and might still have some troops there, that's got to be a big deal for Putin. It really touches on this idea of sovereignty and who controls their own borders.
Right. So it's about territorial integrity.
Exactly.
Okay. So his second question was about whether Ukraine would be able to build up their forces and get new weapons during this 30-day ceasefire. It almost feels like there's this fundamental lack of trust, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And this isn't the first time Putin has brought this up. He's worried that any kind of pause in the fighting would just give Ukraine a chance to rearm and reorganize their troops, basically like a tactical timeout that ends up helping them in the long run. And this totally lines up with what his foreign policy advisor, Yuri Ushakov, said. He actually called the ceasefire proposal nothing more than a temporary respite for the Ukrainian military. I mean, that tells you a lot about how Russia is really viewing this whole thing.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so then the third question that Putin raised was about who would actually be in charge of making sure both sides were sticking to the ceasefire along the huge 2,000-kilometer front line. That just sounds like a total logistical nightmare.
It really does. I mean, how do you actually guarantee that both sides are going to comply, across such a massive area that's constantly changing? Who would even have the resources and the people, and maybe even more importantly, the authority to do that kind of monitoring in a way that everyone trusts? These are really basic questions, but they need real answers before anyone can even think about putting a ceasefire in place that will actually last.
You're right. It's not that simple. So we can see that this ceasefire proposal has a lot of obstacles to overcome. Let's move on to this other really interesting thing that Trump brought up, this idea of dividing assets. He specifically mentioned land and power plants. I mean, that's a huge statement with some pretty big consequences.
It's a really big deal, yeah. He actually said that this call with Putin will involve discussions about land and power plants, and he even went so far as to say that a lot of it's already been talked about by both sides, Ukraine and Russia. and that negotiators are starting to divide up certain assets. Now, if that's true, it means there might be a willingness, at least on Trump's part, to consider some kind of territorial changes or maybe agreements about who controls key infrastructure as part of a peace deal. Just the fact that they're talking about dividing assets is a pretty big shift, you know? It means they're not just talking about stopping the fighting, they're talking about the future of Ukraine and its relationship with Russia. That's massive.
Yeah, and when you mention land, it's obviously a super sensitive topic, given that Russia has already annexed, chunks of Ukrainian territory. And when he said power plants, it makes you immediately think of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant.
Right.
Can you remind us why that specific power plant is so strategically important?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So Zaporizhia, it's the biggest nuclear power plant in all of Europe. And Russia took control of it pretty early on in the conflict. It's strategically important for a few reasons. First, it's a major source of energy. Second, by controlling it, Russia has a lot of leverage, in this whole conflict. And third, there's this constant fear that something could go wrong there, like a nuclear accident in the middle of a war zone. That would be a disaster on a global scale. So yeah, who controls Zaporizhia? It's a really, really big deal.
Right, it's not just about Ukraine. It affects everyone.
Yeah.
So this concept of dividing assets, it kind of lines up with some of the things Russia's been saying they want out of this conflict. What are some of their main objectives that they keep bringing up over and over again?
What's interesting is they keep talking about these ironclad security guarantees. That's their phrase. And what they basically mean is they want to make sure that Ukraine stays neutral and that it never, ever joins NATO. The deputy foreign minister, Alexander Grushko, he was just talking about this again this week. But it's not just about NATO. They also seem to want some kind of buffer zone, between them and Ukraine, and they want to limit Ukraine's military and who they can make alliances with. On top of that, Russia really wants to keep the territories they've already annexed, places like Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and of course Crimea. They want those changes to be permanent, like written into any peace agreement they sign.
And they've also been pretty clear that they don't want any foreign troops in Ukraine after the conflict is over, and that includes troops from NATO countries.
Yeah. Exactly. They see any foreign military presence, especially from NATO, as a threat, a hostile act. They basically consider those countries as part of the conflict, Yeah. And that creates a big obstacle if you're trying to come up with some kind of peacekeeping force or security arrangement for after the war, because a lot of those ideas would involve foreign troops being in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a tough situation. So let's switch gears and look at things from Ukraine's point of view. President Zelensky, he hasn't exactly been sounding super hopeful about all this, has he?
No, not really. Zelensky has actually come right out and accused Putin of deliberately stalling on this ceasefire proposal and basically ignoring any attempts at diplomacy. He's also really worried about all the Russian troops that are still building up near the border. To Ukraine, that looks like Russia isn't really serious about de-escalating the situation.
Right. And we also heard that Ukraine sees its foothold in that Kursk region as a valuable bargaining chip, even though they've pulled back from that logistics hub in Sudzha.
They have.
How do we make sense of that? It seems kind of contradictory.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation. When Ukraine went into Kursk, it was a bold move and kind of unexpected. And even though they've given up some ground now, the fact that they were able to get inside Russia in the first place, that has some weight, both symbolically and maybe strategically, they were probably hoping to use that presence as leverage in any future negotiations. It shows that they can take the fight to Russia if they have to. But pulling back from Sudzha, which was a key supply point for their troops in Kursk, that tells us that the military situation on the ground is a big factor in their decisions, too.
Right. They have to be realistic about what they can hold. And speaking of the situation on the ground, it sounds absolutely brutal right now. Heavy airstrikes from both sides and reports of Russia making advances. They've apparently taken Stepove in Zaporizhia, and they're pushing harder in Kursk.
And that's a crucial point to remember. While all these diplomatic talks are happening, the actual fighting is still going on, and in some places it seems to be getting even worse. Russia says they've taken back most of Kursk, and they're reporting advances in Zaporizhia too. It just shows how unstable and dangerous this whole situation is. And whatever happens on the battlefield, it's definitely going to have a big impact on the negotiations and whether they can actually reach any kind of agreement.
Yeah, for sure. The two are totally connected.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is obviously not happening in a vacuum. What are we seeing from the rest of the world? How are other countries reacting and getting involved?
It's a mixed bag, really. You've got some cautious optimism, some skepticism, and a little bit of hope sprinkled in there. The EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, she's pretty skeptical. She said she thinks Russia isn't really interested in peace and that they're just using the negotiations to try to get what they want. So she's basically saying that Russia might not be acting in good faith.
But then you have someone like French President Macron, who's taking a much stronger stance.
Right. Macron has basically said that if Ukraine wants allied forces on its territory, it's not Russia's place to say no. And that goes directly against Russia's insistence that they don't want any foreign troops in Ukraine. It's a major point of disagreement that could really cause problems down the road.
And it looks like the UK is already thinking ahead to what might happen if there is a peace deal.
Yeah, they are. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, he said that Russia's response to the ceasefire proposal wasn't good enough. And he announced that the UK is putting together a coalition of the willing, which would be made up of more than 30 countries who could contribute to a peacekeeping force if a peace deal is reached. So they're definitely being proactive, thinking about what comes next.
That's interesting. And Poland's foreign minister, he seems to think that Trump might actually be the guy to pull this off.
He does. Radoslaw Sikorski said he hopes that Trump can be the deal maker that everyone says he is and that he can get a good outcome for Ukraine. But at the same time, he emphasized that Russia shouldn't be allowed to just stay in Ukrainian territory. It's not fair.
Right. We also saw that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio talked to his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, was the main thing they discussed.
Well, officially, they talked about the next steps after those meetings in Saudi Arabia, and they agreed to try and get the communication channels between the U.S. and Russia working again. They didn't specifically mention the ceasefire proposal, but if they're going to de-escalate the situation or work out some kind of settlement, they need to be able to talk to each other.
Definitely. And then there's Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, who sounded pretty positive after his meeting with Putin.
Yeah, he did. Witkoff said the talks were positive and solutions-based, and that they've even managed to narrow down some of the differences between the two sides. So you've got someone who's directly involved in these talks being optimistic. It's an interesting contrast to the more cautious reactions we're hearing from other world leaders.
Okay, so one last thing we need to talk about is the military situation. It's constantly changing, and it's a huge factor in all of this diplomacy. We heard that Russia's saying they've taken back most of the Kursk region after Ukraine's incursion last year.
Right, and that's a pretty big development. Russia saying they control most of Kursk, plus Ukraine confirming that they've withdrawn from Sudza. It means the balance of power in that border region has shifted.
Yeah, and there were also reports of Russia destroying Ukrainian drones and taking Stepov in Zaporizhia. It all points to the fact that the fighting is still really intense and that both sides are trying to gain ground.
Absolutely. All this military action just goes to show that even though the diplomatic talks are happening, the conflict is far from over. Both sides are still actively trying to win. And there were even reports that North Korean troops were helping Russia in their offensive in Kursk around the time when U.S. aid was temporarily suspended. That's not confirmed. But if it's true, it adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing.
Yeah. It's a very complicated situation. So to sum up for everyone, Trump is planning to have this call with Putin, which could be a really big deal. The 30-day ceasefire is on the table, but it's facing some major roadblocks because Russia has a lot of conditions, and they're not totally convinced it's a good idea. Then you have this idea of dividing up assets like land and power plants, which is a pretty big deal, and hints at the possibility of concessions and maybe even redrawing some borders. Meanwhile, Russia keeps pushing for those security guarantees they want. Ukraine is focused on defending itself and holding on to what it can. And the rest of the world is watching with a mix of hope and worry as the fighting continues. Hopefully now you have a much clearer picture of what's going on and all the different perspectives involved. You can see the story behind the headlines.
Exactly. And you can see just how much uncertainty there is about what's going to happen next. This is a really complex situation, and there are no easy answers.
No. So here's something to think about as you process all this information. Russia wants to keep the territory it's taken, and they want Ukraine to stay neutral. Ukraine wants to defend its sovereignty and keep its internationally recognized borders. So given those two very different positions, what would a realistic scenario for dividing assets actually look like? What kind of choices might Ukraine and its allies have to make? Choices that might be really difficult or even painful. This is a critical moment in this conflict, and we encourage you to keep digging into all these layers and all the tough questions they raise.
It's a lot to think about, that's for sure.
It really is.
But it's important.
Definitely.
Okay. Yeah.
Until next time.
Take care.